Good morning, everyone. My name is Councillor Gary Crawford. I'm the chair of the Budget Committee. The clerk has confirmed that we do have quorum, and I'd like to call the meeting 36 to order and welcome everyone here and Happy New Year. This is the last budget of this term of council. Today's meeting is being held with members of the Budget Committee participating by video conference. City staff are also connected to the meeting by video conference. The public will continue to participate electronically and can watch the meeting streaming live on YouTube at youtube.com/Toronto Council City Council Live. These measures, of course, are necessary to comply with the public health guidelines and prevent the spread of COVID-19. As with all of our meetings, I ask for your patience. If we experience any delays and technical issues, more than likely we'll have one or two of them during the process. City Clerk has provided all agenda materials in the Clerk's meeting portal. Clerk's IT staff are going to be available to participants to help with your devices. Members, please keep your mic muted, and during today's presentation, please keep your video turned so we can see you. And I recognize there's one issue with one of the members who can't turn on her video at the point, but she is with us. If there are any visiting members of council attending the meeting today, I encourage you to turn on your video so that I know that you are present and can give you the opportunity to ask questions of staff or to speak. This will also assist the clerk's staff to record attendance for the meeting. Just want to let everybody know that the city manager's presentation is live now, and you'll be able to view it on TIMIS or CMP as we go through the presentation. Although we are meeting in different locations and meeting remotely today, the committee would like to acknowledge that the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And we also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. First order of the business, are there any declarations of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? If you do have an interest, please raise your hand. Seeing none, Councillor McKelvey, would you be able to move that? All in favor? Opposed? That's carried. This is a special meeting of the Budget Committee, the launch of the 2022 capital and operating budgets. We only have one item on today's meeting, and it is a presentation from the City Manager and the Chief Financial Officer and Treasurer. Following the presentation, I'm going to open the floor to questions from councillors, and I'll be creating a list of names. Again, the questions will be on the presentation only, and once the full budget has been opened, we'll be dealing with that next week. And that will be the budget review meeting. Those will be taking place on January 18th, 19th, and 20th, and again, that'll be published this afternoon after the meeting adjourns. The agenda for the 2022 budget review meeting will include staff recommended tax-supported budgets and the schedule for presentations from city divisions, agencies, that we're going to be hearing next Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. The agenda is also going to include the detailed budget notes for the tax-supported programs and agencies in the City of Toronto. And I'd like to just first of all thank staff for the incredibly hard work over the last number of weeks and months in preparing these budget notes. Wanted to bring up, talk a bit about briefing notes and briefing notes requests that will be coming in during the process. Traditionally, we move these and vote on them on the last day of review, which would be next Thursday, January 20th. And due to ongoing staffing challenges, staff deployments, it's going to be very difficult, members, to turn around some of their requests in a timely manner. We do our best each year to try to do that. This year may be a little more challenging than the others. So a couple of things I'd like to request from you. If you could please forward your request to the clerk and give permission to share them with myself and staff as soon as possible. That'll give staff the ability to, number one, review quickly and potentially start working on them prior to them actually being moved on Thursday. That would just help us get some things. So if you have anything, please get them in as quickly as possible. Also, please take into account the amount of time it may take to complete a particular briefing note. It's called brief for a reason. So just get a sense of if this is going to take a lot of staff time before you move it, it would be appreciated. And if there's any questions that you can ask as part of the review instead of issuing or moving a briefing note, that would help. Again, staff have come to me saying that there could be challenges. The intent is to try to get all of them done, but again, we just want to be respectful of the challenges that they have. Budget Committee will hear the public speakers on Monday, January 24th and Tuesday, January 25th. This year, because we're meeting virtually as we did last year, we're going to be meeting as a whole committee over those 2 days to hear from the public. Members of the public who wish to speak to the Budget Committee can register to do so emailing buc@toronto.ca and choosing one of the following time slots on either January 24th or 25th. You will have from 9:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m., 1:30 to 4:30 p.m., or 6 to 9 p.m. in the evening session, each of those 2 days. After we hear from the public, the Budget Committee will again meet on January 28th and February 7th to make our final recommendations. That'll go to Executive Committee on February 11th, and then from there it'll go off to full council with a special meeting on Thursday, February 17th. Members, are there any questions about process before I hand it over to the City Manager for the presentation?
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Councillor Carroll, it's not so much a question as a point of personal privilege. I really have to raise so that the public is aware. I really feel at a disadvantage this budget process more than any other. The materials have just now been posted. My staff are behind me furiously trying to print them out because I find it really difficult to follow a presentation on this tiny screen. It's an accessibility issue. I have to do this on my multifocals to be able to see while I'm doing it, and you can't flip back and forth. During the what should be the thorough review process of the Budget Committee, any briefing that I missed during my daughter's cancer surgery, my Chief of Staff was not allowed to keep the materials. So I need to raise a point of personal privilege that it's going to be difficult for me to ask the questions you'd like us to ask today, and difficult for me to avoid briefing notes given the lack of engagement we've been allowed to have in this process up to this moment.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Carroll. I appreciate your comments. Any other questions? Okay, Mr. City Manager, the CFO, I'll pass it over to you for the presentation.
So thank you so much, Chairman Crawford and committee, and I recognize the comment that Councillor Carroll has made, and you know, obviously we're pulling together a lot of information, but to your point, to receive it in a timely fashion, as I think we've been successful to do, certainly in the past. We certainly apologize for any inconveniences that it does generate. So your point is understood. Like last, and if I can, just if it's not too late, you know, Happy New Year to everyone, if we can still make that comment. And not unlike previous years, I will provide an overview in the slides that I'm presenting on, and our Chief Financial Officer and Treasurer will, Heather Taylor will provide an overview of the operating budget as well. We'll do the wrap up, and of course, as in previous years, Steve Conforti will provide an overview of the 10-year capital program. And Chair, as you point out, this is the last balanced budget of this term of council. And so as much as I think we've been seized with COVID for quite a while now, and I think you'll see through the balance of this presentation, a lot has been accomplished. Yes, we've responded well to COVID, and we continue to do so. And in fact, the latest round of the virus has certainly contributed to us having to make sure that it's considered in the budget. So it's certainly taken some added time. But we've accomplished a lot, and I hope that through this course of the presentation that becomes clear. But you know, before we go much further, I absolutely have to thank staff, not just the staff that put together, you know, this incredibly detailed, important final budget, but also to council. And I think you will see in some of Heather's presentation, you know, the recognition, not just from us, but from outside agencies that we work with. They noticed how we work together. And it's, I'd say, gratifying that there is a relationship, a good relationship between us. And so with that, if we can maybe move to the second slide, or actually the first slide, and then we can, let's go straight to the second slide, please. So, I mean, it's a term that I think I started when I joined this organization in 2018 to use, because it really underscores what the essence of public service is, and that is to earn people's trust and confidence. And so it starts our presentation, because that's what we always try to do. We try to do that obviously with you, and we try to do that with you know, the residents and the businesses and everyone that we serve in this community. And so there's no question that COVID has put considerable pressure on Canada's largest and fastest growing municipality. And it has certainly caused to bend us, but certainly never break us. And if there's a word that maybe sums up this term, or at least this experience of going through COVID, is we used it again this morning in the command team. It's the word pivot, and we've pivoted a lot. And so we have, through the course of this term, planned for recovery. And I think, you know, you'll see a lot of evidence of that. We've also, though, witnessed firsthand, and we knew before that there was a challenge in this community with, you know, equity deserving groups, and our need to take serious reconciliation. So that has to be centered in our mind, and we'll speak more about that. And of course, managing, you know, a financial system, ensuring that we have, you know, the revenues to make sure that services are maintained, has been a real challenge, as you all know. But certainly, with the help of the federal and provincial government, you know, we have been able to, you know, deal with the pressures. And we are in no different position this year. We also have responded to you know, the needs of the homeless. And so we have expanded our shelter capacity. We have certainly had to rightfully support small businesses. Our downtowns are experiencing stressors that they haven't before, but certainly our small businesses needed our help, along with the help of other levels of government. We have certainly cared for our seniors and our children. And so finally, you know, in terms of public health and its response, you know, the vaccine, as we've called them, Team Toronto, the vaccine program is absolutely world class. We have administered more than 6 million vaccines. In fact, we are, as of today, we have been successful in getting at least one dose of a vaccine to children ages 5 to 11. About 47% have received that dose. That puts us in the top 10 of the 35 health units in Ontario. So again, we have led in that manner. All of this to, of course, continue to keep our eye on building trust and confidence with you, and certainly with this community. Next slide. I think in some respects, hopefully to all of you, the title says it all. The impact of this pandemic has been profound, ongoing, and certainly still evolving. And of course, we had to, you know, we had to address the challenges, and I think we've done that. And I think I have to stress this, is that we've maintained services. And, you know, we've invested in communities. We have modernized where we needed to modernize. Maybe another way of saying is that we paid attention to the foundation of our organization and the things that people in this community rely on. And that we made sure that we delivered services both internally and externally well. And that we didn't remain static. In fact, if you look at a number of the ways in which we deliver service, they changed. In fact, they got better, made available to people 24/7. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes, but let's make no mistake, and I will pause and maybe slow down here. Make no mistake, the 2022 budget is still a COVID budget. We have approached our jobs with a whole of government, whole of community, and we know, as much as this year will be a challenge, the revenues aren't going to spring back. The costs are not going to disappear next year and the year after. So, you know, again, the challenge is in front of us right now for this budget, but this is not going away. And so recovery, you know, prosperity, the notion that maybe before, you know, some got rich and many didn't. You know, we need to redefine what prosperity means to us. And so it needs to focus on, matters related to our socioeconomic, challenges, as well as climate action. I think, it's a generational commitment that we have to make. So the idea of prosperity really has to be for all. And so we have put together the plans to build on a foundation, which I believe is strong. Next slide. So what this I think slide attempts to capture is that, yes, this operating and capital budget that we're going to hear more about in detail, the principles that really underpin it are, as I've just said, really relate to how we see prosperity and what must we, continue to invest in. And so equity and reconciliation is got to be foremost in our minds, as is climate action, which, as I said, is a generational commitment as well. And then, of course, a topic that I hear from the major cities across Canada when I meet with the CAOs and the city managers is, the mental health and well-being of our citizens. And so, we have a part to play in that as well. What you see at the bottom, though, are really the building blocks of the foundation that really guides this community from our standpoint, our responsibilities. And so city building and mobility, continues as one of the fastest growing cities in the world. It's important how we build out our city, obviously. And so is the mobility, and mobility being, yes, transit, of course, but, active transportation, sorry. So, the investments that we make in cycling and walking, all of which are critically important, and we've done a lot of work over this term. We're seeing it in terms of small businesses, certainly right now, as they struggle with, lockdowns, and then we open up and then we do it again. And so the challenges that small businesses have been facing, and the efforts that we've made to, and you'll hear more about that in terms of taxation in this budget. People, housing, and neighborhoods, really one of the essences of our community. As much as, when we talk about mobility in my world, the way I see things is I'll breathe in transit and I'll breathe out housing, and because those are our major challenges. And so, we're quite fortunate to have the kinds of investments that are taking place in this community right now in transit, but what we're doing in our neighborhoods and how we help people that are struggling is equally important. Climate action and resilience, another fundamental block in our foundation. You heard just recently from us reports around what it is that we need to do to be aggressive in this field and make critical investments to help not just us, but future generations survive. Well-run city and city finances, it's the stuff that doesn't get much attention because it's maybe not seen as a citizen-facing type service, but it's something that many of us take a lot of pride in, and how we deliver our services, and how the back of house work is done, and how we support the hiring of people, and how we support the accounting of our expenses, and how we pay for things, and how we run things. I think really important. And of course, our public health and safe reopening strategy, which is, again, something that we're not looking to figure out. I mean, we have a plan. We know what it is that we need to be focused on. And of course, with Dr. Davila's leadership in that area, we've been well served. Next slide. So, I do have to say, people are watching. They always do. The leadership of Toronto City Council through this term, which I think should be recognized. You've had to make a lot of not just tough but important decisions over the 4 years that we've been together, and it's going to be critically important to give hope to people that as this virus gets behind us, as we look to more brighter days ahead. How it is that you and together with ourselves need to continue to have an important, strong relationship. And so, we have without a doubt put together one of the most successful vaccine strategies, with over 6 million doses having been administered. And we keep doing that, and now focusing on more vulnerable populations that need to be served. And again, I think it's so important that we not just focus on emergency critical and essential services, but all services that keep the business of Toronto moving forward. So we've made sure that we have not lost ground in those other services that we don't always talk too much about. Of course, public health, transit, socioeconomic recovery, as I think I've pointed out, has been very much in the front of our mind, as well as those that struggle in our community that absolutely rely on us. And in terms of certainly shelters, but affordable supportive housing, areas that we are making critical investments in, which you'll hear more about, that are so essential in order to having a community that looks after all people. Expand and modernize digital services. I can't help but recall when COVID started and we had to pivot from working in the office to working from home, how literally in weeks we went from serving a few hundred to several thousand people. And of course, what we've understood, and I would argue, and I think some of you will recall, in the day, so to speak, how community development was always something important to us. And so how we worked with people, how we partnered with them, well, we had no choice. We had to get back and do more of that. And I think a lot of the successes that we talk about here are really shared successes. And of course, with that comes the relationships with the regions and the province and the federal government, and very constructive discussions with administrators and administrators, as well as politicians, to make sure that the needs of Canada's largest municipality, and one that anchors one of the most important economic regions, are understood and addressed. Next slide. You've seen this slide or variations of it before, but just of course, in 2022, our budget, the stressors of that budget are, as you understood before, certainly revenues. Transit is not seeing the kind of ridership that we are used to, and so that is in parking, but more so transit, which is not uncommon, as you know, right across this country. Every major municipality has a transit system is seeing real hardship. And of course, the cost of services is only gone in one direction, and so for a whole bunch of really good reasons. And we've had, obviously impacts to critical services as well, and we've talked about it. We've had to make investments in cybersecurity. An organization as large as ours, and we had an unfortunate experience, obviously, with TTC, but making sure we make those critical investments as we move more and more into a digital world. We have to make sure that digital world is secure. And of course, inflation, which we're starting to see move in a direction I don't think many of us want to see, but nonetheless, it's there. And then, of course, we have done our own part in this story. And when you look to the right on this slide, I have to remind everyone, in 2020, we had approved the budget in February. And then, really it was March that we were starting to see the early signs of COVID and what it was going to do. And so that early sign told us that we were going to see a lot of things stressed, and they happened. So in 2020 overall, it was a $1.7 billion impact, of which, we had to deal with a number of major challenges to the tune of $534 million. Of course, the Safe Restart Agreement funding did start flowing, and so upper levels of government, came and helped. But, bear in mind, there was a responsibility that we took on, and we played our role, and we continued to do that in really what was the first COVID budget, which was 2021. And as you see, there was a significant effort made in that budget to try and keep our costs down overall, and that $573 million it was our contribution to making sure that we didn't let things go. We have a $75 million transit-related revenue or source of income that is, we understand is coming, but I nonetheless do have to point it out as something that we're expecting to see given to us, I believe, from the province, in the next short while. But the balance, which all total is $1.6 billion, was given in the way of support to Toronto. And of course, in 2022, we wanted to make sure you understood that, the Omicron has been factored into, our budget this year. And so all in, we're estimating in the order of about $1.4 billion support is going to be necessary. But that again is in addition to the $494 million that we have been able to identify as ways in which we can try to lessen the load or the responsibility or the challenge of again, another difficult budget. So all totaled, $1.6 billion over the last few years has been the effort that the City of Toronto has made. Next slide. I mean, it's something that I think we always have to remind ourselves. I mean, Toronto is a very unique city in the Canadian landscape, and it has to lead, and has been leading on a number of different fronts. And so, in order to have any credibility, I would say, with federal and provincial government counterparts, I mean, we have to demonstrate that we've taken this challenge seriously and have responded in a variety of ways. And of course, one of them is to make sure that from a funding standpoint, that we have done our share. And so all total, 1.6 billion is what we have been able to commit to, a very difficult financial situation. And so with that, we've talked about last year, and we have seen proof from last year, and we'll see hopefully proof again this year, that the whole of government, whole of community approach, which we've relied on, has and we expect will continue to work. So as of this moment, what have we heard from the federal and provincial government? I mean, I don't have I think I said this last year, I don't have a check in hand. And we are certainly expecting that we will hear from them as to how it is specifically they'll be able to help Toronto. So that work is, as I understand, is in progress. So, but we don't have that that moment right now to be able to say it's all been solved. So, and I know a lot of people are working hard, and of course, Mayor Tory and his office continue to do what they've done in the past and will continue to do in 2022. Next slide. So it's worth pointing out that in the time that we've been dealing with COVID and its consequences, that the other orders of government, of course, province of Ontario and the government of Canada, has contributed in the order of 2.8 billion in pandemic response funding. And so we continue to point out that that this isn't going away and that we're going to continue to need help. And so when we look at this year's budget, but obviously 2023 and 2024 and beyond, this will not end abruptly. We know that. We know from a transit standpoint that the recovery is not going to be instant. And so even if we do go into an endemic state, and the economy will recover, I mean, we will still need to have those strong relationships, certainly helping us with, investments in transit, not just building it, but operating it. Housing and shelters obviously is going to, because we have to make sure that those that do all the work to keep us successful, have a safe, affordable place to live. Downtowns across the country are challenged right now, and we're all working together to figure out what is the best set of policies and investments that need to be made. Public health, I don't probably have to say much about that. Digital infrastructure, the way we deliver services is evolving, and Toronto is leading in that front. And of course, climate action. I mean, it's a clear message of the federal government, and certainly the provincial government has an interest or a stake in it, and certainly we are committed to making everything that we can do to lessen the consequence of climate change done. Next slide. So, from a community standpoint, the partnerships that have existed before COVID and the ones that have been formed in order to respond to COVID really it explains a lot of our success. So Team Toronto, as we fondly call them, that have focused on how to get the vaccine out and to work with partners that have credibility and confidence in our neighborhoods. We've done that. So we've worked with 410 community ambassadors and of course 155 agencies, which explains why we are one of the top cities in the world in terms of getting people to accept a vaccine. And of course, the Black Scientist Task Force on Vaccine Equity has been important to us. Struck relationships this term, and we're starting to see some really interesting work coming out of Civic Lab TO with the universities and colleges of this community that we're leveraging. And of course, the partnerships that we have with many not-for-profit organizations that without them, how do we keep, Toronto moving in the right direction? So those partnerships that are managed largely by our community and social services people continue to be critical to us. We struck relationships with the University Health Network. We're engaged in some of our first social medicine as well as supportive housing efforts. So this is an excellent model that we're going to advance. Transit service integration is Rick Leary is working with Brampton, Mississauga, York in terms of improving transit across those boundaries. And of course, I work regularly with the big cities in Canada where we share a lot of common interests, and a lot of really good work is happening with respect to our colleagues within Canada's largest economic region called the Greater Toronto Hamilton area. So next slide. So in summation, the critical issues that we're facing, we absolutely, it's not that we just need to project an image of hope. It's actually grounded in good evidence that we are we have a good foundation. We are heading in the right direction. We need to stay strong. We need to maintain our services and invest where people would expect us to, and all the matters that we've identified that are key to prosperity. Yes, this is a COVID budget. I think that. We need to continue to address the Indigenous and Black and equity deserving disparities that exist. We need to take them, obviously seriously, which I believe we do, but we need to do more. And yes, the fiscal challenges aren't just in 2022. We need the ongoing commitments of upper levels of government. We need to work well with our community partners. And of course, our decisions and actions must be guided by social, climate, and economic outcomes if we are going to achieve the kind of prosperity that I think Torontonians and quite frankly, the country expects us to achieve. Next slide. We'll turn the floor over to Heather.
Thanks, Chris. Before we get into the 2022 budget, I'd like to take a moment just to acknowledge the hard work and commitment of staff across the entire organization. We don't say thank you enough. They have helped to prepare this year's budget. And today isn't necessarily where we thought we would be when we started our 22 budget process. However, as you'll see today, this still very much remains a COVID-19 budget, as Chris has mentioned. We continue to face significant financial pressures and challenges in our COVID-19 response, but we are looking ahead to our economic and social recovery. So although this is our third year in this term of council, we are experiencing the financial challenges. We continue to make significant progress in addressing financial resilience. We continue to institute best practices to inform our financial decisions. And we're very proud of the progress that's been made in establishing outcome-based budgets, which focus on accountability and establishing trust and confidence with you, council, and the public. We have introduced equity and climate lenses into our planning and tracking of outcomes. And we've been tackling old problems with new solutions. COVID has reinforced how important collaboration is in problem solving. And as Chris mentioned, we've been working with the GTHA and Big Six cities in unprecedented ways. We're collectively coming up with solutions to problems. We're aligning our COVID reporting to ensure all other orders of government have a holistic understanding of municipal impacts. And we have a renewed regional strategy to tackle shared issues, which is increasingly important during these challenging times. Our capital spend rates are increasing, and it's as a result of focusing on achievability and affordability in our 10-year capital plan. And we've seen increased spending from under 60% in 2018 to around 80% this past year. Our annual capital investment of $3.1 billion is vitally important in support of the economy through investment and job growth for Toronto, Ontario, and Canada. Our capital plan continues to grow with prudent investments to fund key city priorities, including housing and climate. Throughout COVID-19, multiple credit rating agencies have maintained Toronto's stable credit rating, noting that city's cohesive council approach and prudent policy and fiscal management have preserved our credit rating throughout this crisis. So as we share with you the 2022 budget, I'd like to reiterate that this is our second COVID-19 budget, but our third year of COVID financial challenges. That means in this term of council, 3 out of 4 years reflect COVID financial impacts. The 2022 operating budgets total $14.99 billion, including the rate-supported budgets that were approved in December. Our 10-year capital plans combined total $46.58 billion, with $16 billion from the rate-supported capital plan also approved this past December. So as we do every year, we establish a set of guiding principles to prepare a staff recommended budget while ensuring the ballot is budget as legislatively required. Our first principle is to manage the COVID-19 impacts and ensure the path for recovery is established. Since March 2020, we've responded to COVID-19 related demands across many of our city services. Our second principle is to preserve existing services while complying with public health guidelines and legislative requirements, with a focus to also protect our service levels in our recovery from COVID-19. And thirdly, we've prepared a budget that promotes tax affordability for residents and businesses, reflecting an inflationary tax increase. This is particularly important given the impacts and uncertainties people have experienced throughout COVID-19. Finally, we are focused on building a prosperous Toronto for all, with emphasis on equity and reconciliation, climate action, and health and well-being. The pandemic has emphasized the need to continue investments in prosperity and has highlighted the social and health inequities that exist amongst Torontonians. In order to advance prosperity for all, the City of Toronto is committed to delivering services with fair and equitable outcomes for all residents and businesses. In addition, Toronto's climate action initiatives reflect the climate change emergency and our commitment to achieving the city's net zero goals. And finally, we are committed to Toronto's neighborhoods and communities being safe, healthy, livable, and vibrant for residents and businesses now and into the future. So as I've mentioned, the 2022 staff recommended operating budgets total $14.99 billion. Back in December, Council approved the rate-supported operating budget of $1.96 billion. So today we're going to focus on the tax-supported budget of just over $13 billion. As reflected in our guiding principles, we're committed to preserving existing service levels while adhering to public health guidelines. We're keeping taxes affordable with an inflationary residential property tax increase of 2.9%. This is reflective of the 12-month average in Toronto. The COVID financial impacts remain significant. The 2022 budget requires $1.4 billion through continued partnerships with the federal and provincial governments to ensure we can continue to respond to the pandemic. The 2022 budget also supports economic recovery and includes a 15% property tax rate reduction for small businesses. Our 2022 budget enhances social recovery with a total of $135 million of new and enhanced investments to build a prosperous Toronto focused on equity and reconciliation, modernization, and a safe and livable city. I'll speak to those in a few moments. This slide captures 8 years of historical opening budget pressures driven by inflation and growth in demand of city services. You can clearly see the impacts of COVID-19 on the city's finances for the last 3 years. Going into 2022, we were already facing inflationary and growth-related pressures of $583 million. With COVID-19, that opening budget pressure was increased to $2 billion. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, the budget process takes months of planning. It was developed prior to Omicron surfacing in December. So given the timing, we've reflected the financial impacts based on the best available data and assumptions in an extremely short time frame. As we've done for the past 2 years, we will monitor and reflect COVID-19 impacts throughout the year, including the impacts of Omicron. And unfortunately, we know the COVID-19 financial impacts will be experienced for years to come. We continue to work internally to manage and mitigate as much of the city's pressures as we can. And as Chris mentioned earlier, since the onset of the pandemic, the city has implemented mitigation measures, offsets, and spending restraints equal to $1.6 billion to address pressures and support the continuance of service delivery. We are committed to continuing to find offsets where possible while preserving essential services for residents and businesses. So while I'm proud of the significant mitigation efforts of the city, the COVID challenges are too substantial for us to address on our own. We need continued support from our federal and provincial partners. Ongoing support in response to COVID-19 is critical to ensure our service continues for 2022. We require $1.4 billion in funding supports from other orders of government. COVID-19 has had a significant operating impact on many of the services delivered by the city's divisions and agencies, and we continue to feel the impacts of COVID-19 on transit services, where reduced ridership has resulted in significant revenue loss. But it's essential that we keep our buses and our subways going to ensure people can get to work and support our economy. We've implemented physical distancing measures in our shelters in adherence with the provincial public health guidelines. COVID-19 has impacted our corporate revenues with reduced dividends from the Toronto Parking Authority, Toronto Hydro, and reduced municipal accommodation tax. And of course, we're seeing increased public health costs in response to COVID-19 in support of the provincial health goals. While we require COVID-19 funding to support our 2022 operating budget, these investments by the provincial and federal governments also benefit the economy for the entire GTHA region, the province, and the country. Similar to how we've approached our last few budgets, in addition to COVID-19 funding required, the city expects it will continue to be supported by the Government of Canada for refugee costs of $61 million, now that the Canadian borders have reopened. We also require funding supports of $27 million from the province of Ontario for the continuation of supportive housing initiatives they committed to in 2021. Of the balanced $13 billion budget, I'd like to highlight where the money comes from and how the money's invested. So you'll see on the left side of this slide, it reflects where the money comes from, but it also highlights anticipated lost revenues due to COVID-19, shown in dark blue. Over 35% comes from our predictable property tax. For 2022, property tax revenue totals $4.65 billion. Federal and provincial funding represents 31% of the city's overall revenue. Of this $4 billion amount, $1.4 billion represents the required funding as a result of COVID that I mentioned on the previous slide. $61 million reflects the refugee support, and $27 million is for continued supportive housing. And the remainder of the $2.4 billion is for our cost-shared programs. This year, we are anticipating approximately $800 million in transit revenue. While this is an increase over 2021, we are still experiencing the impacts of COVID-19 on the return of ridership, resulting in a total COVID impact of $560 million. Land transfer tax is being budgeted at $950 million, of which $150 million is funding towards our capital plan. So back in 2019, I noted we would develop a strategy to transition away from using an unpredictable funding source for predictable expenses. I committed to establishing the foundation of a sustainable, predictable, effective strategy to transition a portion of MLTT to directly fund the capital program. Due to the strength of the real estate market, we are able to make that change happen this year. Our operating budget is also funded by user fees, comprising of 8%, and other sources such as investment income and dividends, which I just mentioned on the previous slide. So where does the money get spent? On the right-hand side of this slide, I'd like to highlight where the city's investments are being made. 3.8 billion is spent on our cost-shared programs with other orders of government, such as Toronto Employment and Social Services, Children's Services, Shelter Support and Housing, TCHC, long-term care homes, and public health. 2.2 billion is spent on transit operations. And even though the fare box does not cover the same proportion of expenses as pre-pandemic times, we understand how important it is to continue to deliver transit services. In pre-COVID times, the fare box covered 2/3 of the operating expenses. Today, TTC fares cover around 1/3 of the total operating expenses. So just over 2 billion is spent on emergency services, including fire services, Toronto Paramedic Services, and the Toronto Police Service to ensure community safety. We have just over 1 billion in expenditures for corporate and capital financing. This reflects the funding of costs to maintain the city's infrastructure. Over 1 billion will be spent on other city operations, such as Housing Secretariat, City Planning, Court Services, Economic Development and Culture, Municipal Licensing and Standards, and Parks, Forestry and Recreation. Governance and corporate services of just over 850 million includes ensuring a well-run city and enabling our frontline services such as 311, our corporate real estate group, environment and energy, the city manager's office, and the city's accountability officers. Corporate accounts represent expenses incurred on behalf of the entire organization, for example, the city's insurance. And finally, the operational costs of our transportation services and agencies total 870 million combined. So I've just highlighted that a significant portion of the city's budget goes towards cost-shared programs with other orders of government. On an annual and ongoing basis, the City of Toronto invests in extensions of federal and provincial responsibilities. Approximately 23%, or 1.1 billion, of Torontonians' annual property taxes are directly invested in 3 key themes to build a prosperous Toronto for all. We're proud that we're able to support these 3 areas: housing, social and community programs, and healthcare, all from direct contributions from our tax base. Not to mention, we have significant capital investments in these areas, which you'll hear more about in a few moments from Steve. Toronto's commitment to a whole of government approach requires ongoing federal and provincial contributions, and these investments have positive outcomes for Toronto as well as Ontario and Canada. Next slide. Even though this year is a COVID budget, we are making prudent investments to ensure that we're well positioned to recover and rebuild from COVID-19. New and enhanced investments totaling 135 million reflect a combination of fully funded flow-through and cost-shared programs with the federal and provincial governments and direct city spending. We're pleased to be partners with other orders of government in delivery of key services that result in positive outcomes for Torontonians. For example, the Child Care and Early Years Workforce Funding Agreement with the federal government provides one-time funding to be flowed to the childcare sector to support the retention and recruitment of a diverse, high-quality workforce and to enhance access and inclusion of programs. Our new and enhanced investments are above and beyond the ongoing preservation of services and service levels maintained in the operating budget, and significant capital investments in areas of housing and climate. All are focused on laying the foundation for social and economic recovery for Toronto, the region, and the country. They will enhance social and equity initiatives, ensure a safe and livable city for all, and will assist in modernizing our services. For example, we are investing 18.6 million in long-term care reform, which fulfills Council's commitment and responds to provincial legislation for increased individual care. We are investing $5.8 million in reconciliation and combating anti-Black racism by adding resources to deliver the city's first reconciliation action plan, by providing startup costs for the Indigenous Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, and for the Black Food Sovereignty Report and Plan, to name just a few. We are ensuring Toronto is a safe and livable city through enhanced investments of $12.5 million in community safety, including implementing year 3 of our paramedic service multi-year staffing and systems plan, which will add 63 permanent positions. And we are focused on information security with investments of $17.9 million, which is so important in our increasingly digital world. As we look beyond 2022, there is sufficient uncertainty surrounding the city's COVID response requirements, impacts to services as a result of public health measures, and the extent of federal and provincial funding support. As all projections and budgets are supported by assumptions, we're currently forecasting a range for the potential pressures and demands on the city's operating budget in 2023 of $1.2 to $1.7 billion. We will continue to monitor COVID-19 impacts and supports throughout 2022 and update our assumptions accordingly. We will continue to work with the Government of Canada and the Province of Ontario to determine the necessary funding supports to address the unprecedented pressures the city faces. At this time, we are anticipating requiring ongoing funding to ensure recovery in the amount of $500 million to just over $1 billion. This is in addition to ongoing supports anticipated for refugees and supportive housing. The 2022 staff recommended operating budget promotes tax affordability for residents and businesses. The inflationary residential tax rate increase of 2.9% is based on a 12-month average for Toronto. This translates to an increase of $93 for the average home. There is no increase in multi-residential properties, which is in compliance with provincial regulations. Consistent with policy and provincial regulations, the commercial and industrial rate increases are a fraction of the residential rate, with commercial half of the residential rate and the industrial a third. And new for 2022, we are implementing a small business property tax subclass with a 15% property tax rate reduction, which is expected to benefit over 25,000 small businesses. As approved in 2019, there's an incremental increase in the city building fund of 1.5%. This levy is specifically dedicated to investing in transit and housing and leverages a total of $7.2 billion in total funding. This includes almost $800 million that has been invested to date and $6.4 billion to be invested in the next 10 years as reflected in our 10-year capital plan. This will represent a $48 tax increase to the average home. So this slide shows where property tax investments are directed. The average home in Toronto in 2022 has an assessed value of $697,185. The valuation for the current property assessments took place in 2016. And due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Ontario government has postponed the next reassessment. This slide shows where the property tax investments are going. For the average home, the property tax bill will be $3,339. The majority is dedicated to keeping Toronto moving, keeping it safe and livable. You'll see that 28% is invested in emergency services, 18% is invested in transit and transportation, and 14% is invested in cost-shared programs. So now I'd like to turn it over to Steve, who's going to speak to you about the capital budget.
Thank you, Heather. I'd be remiss if I didn't take the opportunity to thank all finance staff across programs and agencies, including our staff of financial planning and our finance and administrative teams. Extraordinary efforts have been undertaken both in developing this year's budget, but also throughout the past 2 years as we manage the financial challenges presented by COVID-19. Moving to capital, it's an honor to have an opportunity to present the staff recommended 10-year capital budgeting plan, which will guide decisions on what investments will be made towards the acquisition, development, and repair or replacement of city infrastructure. As Heather had mentioned, the city's 10-year capital plan totals $45.9 billion when you combine the tax and rate supported budgets. I'll focus on the recommended 10-year capital plan of $30.5 billion for tax supported programs only, as the rate supported budgets that include Toronto Water, Solid Waste, and Parking Authority were approved by Council in December. So consistent with the operating budget, the development of the capital plan was guided by 4 key principles. The first being that the capital plan continues and builds upon investments committed to as part of past budget processes, which included significant increases in state of good repair funding for transit and housing, as well as other capital priorities. There are also new investments being recommended within this year's capital plan, again for housing and transit, but also state of good repair investments and modernization initiatives. The budget was also developed with a climate focus that I'll speak to later in the presentation. Second, and as mentioned by Chris, our partnership with the Government of Canada and the Province of Ontario is vital to fund city programs and services that are supported by our capital assets and infrastructure. We'll continue to leverage the $4.9 billion in federal and provincial funding for investments in key areas, predominantly within mobility and housing. And thirdly, adding to Heather's comment on financial resilience, we continue to focus on developing a capital plan that is both achievable and affordable. The focus builds on actions that began as part of the 2020 budget process. And as a result, we continue to see improved capital spend rates, even with the challenges presented by the pandemic. For 2021, we're expecting a capital spend rate of about 80% compared to an overall spend rate of below 60% just 4 years ago. What is even more impressive is that our increased spending is being driven by some of our largest capital programs, such as Toronto Water, Transportation Services, TTC, and Parks, Forestry, and Recreation, that are all expecting spend rates above 80% in 2021. We intend to see continued improvements in capital spend rates in 2022 and future years. And lastly, the city continues its capital modernization efforts with the key focus over the next year towards the continued development of our capital asset management plan. The city's core infrastructure asset management plan, focusing on water and transportation infrastructure, was completed and approved by Council last November. The work is now being expanding the asset management plan across all city assets. So staff are recommending a 10-year capital plan for the city's tax-supported programs that totals $30.5 billion and capital expenditures, with $3.1 billion planned in 2022. Budget continues to build on the successes achieved as part of the recent budget processes, in large part due to the planned continued 1.5% increase to the City Building Fund. Through the City Building Fund, we continue to support $6.4 billion in funding for critical capital investments in transit and housing. This is in addition to over $800 million in capital investments that have already been funded or committed through the City Building Fund over the last 2 years. We've continued to grow our capital program, and the capital budget makes added investments in key priority areas of mobility with nearly $900 million in added investments over the 10-year period, housing, where we have added just under $1 billion in capital funding, and modernization initiatives with total added investments of about $450 million. While mobility, housing, and modernization are key capital priorities that I'll speak to further, budget was developed with a priority towards investing in state of repair needs, as well as an enhanced focus on how we can leverage our capital investments to support our climate goals. In fact, the city's combined tax and rate capital plans include $15.5 billion in planned investments over the 10 years that include project components dedicated to increasing climate resilience efforts and/or reducing GHG emissions. As noted, the capital plan continues to leverage and incorporate federal and provincial funding that totals $4.9 billion over 10 years, predominantly supporting housing and mobility investments. We continue to grow our capital program, and at the same time, we remain committed to improving capital spend rates. We ensure that projects are budgeted when they are construction ready and that available funding is allocated to both where and when it can be spent. We will continue to provide flexibility to allow acceleration of funding for multi-year commitments, where it has been demonstrated that work can be completed ahead of schedule. The growth and success of our capital program not only supports our infrastructure needs, but it's important to the success of the cities, provinces, and country's economy. It's estimated that we create roughly 9 jobs for every 1 million in capital spending. And again, we plan to spend 3.1 billion in the 2022 capital budget. Lastly, the capital plan is balanced and affordable. We maintained our debt service ratio under 15% for all years within our 10-year planning period. We've included an inflationary increase to our level of capital from current funding. And maintaining our debt service ratio has ensured we continue to receive positive credit ratings, which further enhance our interest rate environments. We've continued to experience success in issuing both social and green bonds to finance capital infrastructure. We've been a leader in this area. We've now issued 780 million in green bonds and 200 million in social bonds, and plan to continue to issue both in 2022. However, as Chris and Heather had mentioned, support from the Government of Canada and Province of Ontario continues to be critical to offset COVID impacts on the city's operating budget. In the event that adequate provincial and federal funding is not forthcoming in 2022, there will be significant impacts on the city's ability to proceed with capital investments, and material adjustments to the capital budget will be required through a reduction in planned funding. Next slide. The tax-supported capital plan totals 30.5 billion over the 10-year planning period and will guide decisions on what investments will be made to purchase, build, and repair city infrastructure. Looking at the chart on how the money is invested, as you can note, the highest investment is in transit at 13.4 billion, which represents 44% of the total capital plan. This builds on the investments committed to in prior years, which through the City Building Fund previously enabled us to double our historical investments in funding towards transit SOGR. The city is also committed to spending 3.3 billion in housing, coupled with a further 4.7 billion investment through foregone revenue in the form of land value and financial incentives. This funding will be used to support the development of 20,000 affordable homes, with the city's direct commitment now fully funded. And will move the city towards the goal of supporting 40,000 new affordable houses under the Housing TO Action Plan. To create the remaining 20,000 new affordable homes, we will require added investments from the federal and provincial governments. We are also investing a further 5.4 billion in mobility through investments in roads and bridge repair and in safety and cycling infrastructure as part of the transportation budget. The city will also spend 3.4 billion on the environment. This includes investments within parks, waterfront revitalization, environment and energy, as well as the TRCA. Additionally, the capital plan was developed with a climate focus and includes capital projects with components dedicated to increasing climate resilience efforts and/or reducing GHG emissions, with total expenditures across our tax and rate budgets of 1.5 billion in 2022 and 15.5 billion over the next 10 years. The city will also be investing 1.6 billion in corporate real estate management. Key investments include the construction of the new Etobicoke Civic Center, modern TO, and other real estate and facility projects. The capital plan also includes 2.7 billion in investments across all other city programs and agencies such as fleet services, library, and technology services. The left side of the chart details how the capital plan is funded. Debt funding totals 6.8 billion and benefits from the use of green and social bonds, while ensuring that our debt service costs remain under 15% in each year of the plan. City Building Fund totals 6.4 billion and is the second largest source of capital funding at 21% and is applied against transit and housing initiatives. There's a further 3.7 billion in capital from current funding. In 2022 alone, the operating budget will contribute nearly 342 million in CFC funding to capital, reflecting an inflationary increase above 2021 levels, and incorporates the transition of MLTT funding to support our capital program. As noted, our capital plan continues to leverage funding partnerships with the Government of Canada and Province of Ontario, with total combined funding of 4.9 billion, reflecting 16% of total capital. Reserve funds account for 2.9 billion in capital plan funding. This level of funding is consistent with commitments against city reserves, where annual contributions are made, often through the operating budget, to support planned capital investments. An example includes fleet reserve contributions that support vehicle procurement. The capital plan also utilizes 2.2 billion in recoverable debt for projects that will return a savings or an added revenue, such as our building retrofit projects, as well as approximately 3.6 billion in various other revenue sources, such as development charge. Next slide. As mentioned, we've continued to grow our capital plan with significant funding directed towards our capital priorities of mobility, housing, and modernization. Within mobility, 882 million in funding has been added, with investments in transit fleet program, including overhauls and acquisitions, advancing work on 3 major capacity improvement projects being Bloor-Yonge, Line 1 and Line 2, investments in cycling infrastructure and trail and pathway expansions, further investments in critical transit projects addressing stated good repair needs, buildings, bridges and tunnels, and fire ventilation upgrades. We're also investing an additional 992 million in housing projects. The majority of the funding will be dedicated to achieving 10,000 units of affordable rental housing under the Housing Now initiative, fully funding the city's direct commitment to this initiative. We're also continuing our investment in TCHC building repair with a further 160 million added to the new 10th year of the capital plan. A further 453 million will be invested in modernization initiatives. Included in this is a Etobicoke Civic Center that is now fully funded and will be the cornerstone of creating a complete community for city-owned lands at Bloor-Kipling. This site will also support the Housing Now initiative and the growth and development of the Etobicoke Center. Further funding will also be invested in the modernization of libraries, services, systems, processes, and technology solutions. Lastly, significant investments of almost 900 million have been added to other key areas, including fire fleet replacement, ensuring the program is fully funded with a 10-year plan facilitating a multi-year acquisition strategy, ferry vessel replacement, park development and recreation management, and stated good repair investments in such areas as roads and bridges rehabilitation, facility and utility upgrades, and childcare centers. While investments in mobility, housing, and modernization have been a priority, the capital plan was developed with an overarching focus across all priorities on achieving stated good repair, as well as applying a climate focus, enabling the city to leverage our capital investments to support our climate goals. So as mentioned, the capital plan was developed with a climate focus. In developing the capital plan, staff identified opportunities to leverage our 46.6 billion in planned tax and rate supported capital investments for the next 10 years to support our goals of reducing GHG emissions and improving climate resilience, ensuring consideration of infrastructure investments involve a climate focus as part of the decision-making process. Through these efforts, staff have identified planned investments in capital projects with components dedicated to these climate goals that add up to 15.5 billion over the 10-year planning period. This is evident in the decisions that are being made in our investments in buildings, mobility and fleet, and water and waste, which reflect the main sources of the city's corporate emissions. You may have seen a recent announcement on our recommended fully electric ferry fleet replacement strategy, which is a great example of our climate focus, where we're able to leverage added capital funding to address a capital need while also advancing our climate goals and supporting our net zero strategy. This approach to capital budgeting is further expressed in building investments. The net zero carbon plan has been developed to provide a roadmap to achieving net zero emissions in city-owned buildings through a variety of investments such as deep energy retrofits, energy conservation and demand management, as well as building automation systems, our modern TO program, and the construction of net zero facilities. Additionally, the city's capital subsidy to TCHC supports reducing energy consumption in its buildings by 25% by 2028. In mobility and fleet, TTC is targeting to have 20% of its bus fleet to be zero emission vehicles by 2025-2026 and 50% by 2030. Specific investments include the purchase of electric and hybrid buses, along with the expansion of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Further investments are being made by the city towards electrical vehicle fleet replacement and our green fleet plan, our fleet share program, and electrical vehicle charging infrastructure. The expanded City of Toronto corporate EV charging station network is expected to have 350 charge ports available by the end of 2022 and 1,200 charge ports available by 2025 at more than 100 city locations. City investments also aim to provide reliable, affordable, and safe mobility options through its investment in transit and expanding transit access and cycling infrastructure. Further investments were already approved by Council as part of our rate budget, building wet weather resilience and reducing GHG emissions by investing in wet weather flood projects, basement flooding protection, water efficiency and metering projects, building a third organics processing facility, and landfill gas control and utilization project aimed at reducing GHG emissions. More details on climate-related investments are provided in the climate investing briefing note that is available with today's budget materials. State grid repair funding traditionally reflects the majority of capital spending within the city's 10-year plan. For the 2022 budget, 51% of total capital investments are specific to state grid repair work. Even with our continued focus and growth in SOGR funding, staff continue to project an SOGR backlog that will grow over the next 10 years from $7.4 billion to $16.3 billion. This growth arises from the current age of city infrastructure and the SOGR impact of added capital needs, many identified through the TTC's capital investment plan, with future vehicle needs alone reflecting 2/3 of the TTC's backlog. As noted, addressing the SOGR backlog is a key capital priority. From 2016 to 2020, the city spent $7.8 billion on SOGR work that was used to address infrastructure needs across key areas such as transit, housing, libraries, arenas, and community centers. Key infrastructure investments included $4.6 billion in transit, nearly $500 million in housing, and $1.3 billion in transportation. As part of the 2021 capital budget process, significant gains were made towards addressing the city's SOGR backlog, made possible by prior decisions related to the City Building Fund and TCHC building repair investments. In 2021, over $700 million was targeted to address TTC SOGR. Majority of the SOGR investments were made at ATC resignaling, IT systems infrastructure, and the purchase of streetcars. In 2021, the city also committed $160 million in funding towards TCHC building repairs. The 2022 capital plan continues to advance commitments made as part of prior budget processes. A total of $23.2 billion in our tax and rate budgets will be invested in SOGR over the next 10 years. This includes an added $761 million in investments and continues and advances commitments in transit and TCHC, and also makes further investments in funding towards infrastructure such as city bridges. Moving forward, staff will continue to explore and identify opportunities to further address infrastructure needs through the budget process. We will also leverage the work to be completed on the asset management planning, building on the practices in Toronto Water and Transportation Services to ensure a consistent approach across all city programs that will ultimately provide a uniform strategic lens on how we invest in capital infrastructure across the organization. So I'll turn the presentation back to Heather, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve. So in conclusion, you've heard it a few times, 2022 is still a COVID-19 budget, and we're focused on managing our response and maintaining essential services. We're committed to keeping property taxes affordable at the rate of inflation while investing in key city building initiatives, laying a strong foundation for recovery. And we are focused on economic and social recovery with support for small businesses and new investments of $135 million to build a prosperous Toronto for all, investing in equity and reconciliation, climate change, and health and well-being. Ultimately, we know that continued partnerships with the provincial and federal governments are essential to continuing to respond to and recover from the impacts of COVID-19. So from a scheduling perspective, today is our budget launch. The budget materials will be posted on the clerk's site, which will give council an opportunity to review in advance of the program and agency presentations next week. As the budget chair mentioned, the public will have an opportunity to speak to budget committee on January 24th and January 25th via written submissions or in a virtual format. And budget committee will deliberate and consider the budget on February 7th before it goes to executive committee on February 11th, and then to council for final approval on February 17th. City staff are available to help support and address any queries that you may have throughout the virtual process. Staff do develop budgets with inputs from Torontonians through public engagements throughout the year. We encourage residents and businesses to get involved in the process. Residents can also contact their local city councillor. So finally, again, I would like to say thank you to staff. It's taken the efforts of many people across each and every city division and agency to contribute to the budget process and make it what it is today. We can't say thank you enough for all the efforts during these very challenging and unprecedented times. Often people say it takes a team, but truly it takes a village. Thank you so much.
Thank you. First of all, Chris, Heather, Steve, thank you for the presentation. And again, I just want to thank the dozens, if not hundreds, thousands of city staff all across the city who have worked incredibly hard to pull this together to present to us. So again, thank you for your leadership. Thank you for the work you've done. Members, now we're going to open it up for questions of the presentation of the overall budget. And again, recognizing there's going to be a lot of presentations and questions next week as we get into more detail. So why don't I look at, so we'll start with outside councillors. I see a couple of outside councillors. Councillor Perks has just put up his hand. So why don't we start with Councillor Perks. Again, you'll have 5 minutes and we'll see how things go. Members, if we need to do a second round, we can potentially do another second round. So Councillor Perks, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What's the inflation rate we're assuming in this budget?
Through you, Mr. Chair, the inflationary rate is a 2.9%, which is based on a 12-month trailing inflation rate for the City of Toronto. And that's consistent to what we've done in prior years as well.
Thank you very much. We had an outstanding ask for housing support workers. Is that covered off here from the province?
Through you, Mr. Chair, as Councillor, as noted throughout the presentation, there are ongoing conversations with the province of Ontario and the government of Canada. We do not have any funding commitments as of yet for our asks from a COVID perspective. For cost shared programs, I'm not sure if specifically what you're referring to is a cost shared program that we currently have a commitment for. If you can elaborate maybe a little bit more.
So in the Toronto Housing Plan, we recognize that simply creating housing units for supportive housing units wasn't enough, but we needed support workers to make that viable. And we had asked the province for a number of workers and an amount of money. I want to know if that's budgeted here, not budgeted here, if the ask has been dealt with or not. I see the city manager nodding his head, so maybe he understands.
No, I do understand it. Thank you for clarifying, Councillor. If you go back to one of the slides where we talked about the asks of other levels of government, there was 27 million in supportive housing costs. So that's the commitment that was made in 2021 by the province for 1 year. We have put the budgeted ask back in the 2022 budget. We do not have a commitment, but it is in our budget.
Okay. With the TTC capital plan, I want to know if the capital plan that's in the budget we have here provides all the vehicles in their 10-year capital plan to the level of the TTC fleet plan first, and secondly, if it meets the needs described in the climate plan to add in it, I believe it's an additional 600 vehicles beyond the TTC fleet service plan.
Steve, I'm not sure if you want to take that or for TTC.
I can start, perhaps staff from TTC can jump in. So the plan does continue to include funding consistent with last year's capital plan to advance current orders of TTC fleet. We've added funds for overhaul requirements, but we do not have the full 10-year plan funded, and there's still a portion that's sitting below.
And the vehicles that were described in the in order to meet the climate goals, those additional vehicles, are they there in the 10-year plan?
I'll turn it over. I'll see if we have a staff from TTC that can get into the specifics of those particular vehicles. I know we do.
Yes, good morning. It's Josie Levita. I'm through the chair. What's in the 10-year capital plan allows us to fund the delivery of the 60 streetcars for which we received, provincial and federal funding. Allows us to procure 300 hybrid and 300 e-buses, as well as 70 Wheel-Trans buses. However, there is additional funding required for subway trains that's sitting below the line. And that's work that I know that we're all working towards to try to get some partnership funding on. So the full procurement fleet plan is not fully funded. But we
Okay,
are
that's
looking for-
just the base plan, and so I can assume therefore that the vehicles needed for the climate plan are also below the line.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Uh, you know what? I don't have time to get my next question, and I'll hold on for a second round. Thank you. If we're doing it.
Yeah, well, we'll more than likely do that. Thanks, Councillor. Any other outside councillors questions? Okay, let's take it into committee members who have questions. We'll start with Councillor Carroll and Councillor Layton after that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll go backwards. I'm going to start with capital. Page 31 in the presentation. I'm sorry, I was looking at another thing and I missed part of the explanation of the foregone revenue. This is a zero balance sheet, $30.5 billion on each side. So how does the 4.7 billion appear on the where the money comes from side of the balance sheet?
Thanks, Councillor. So that slide shows the entire 10-year capital plan, our direct funding. And then we also show how we fund those direct investments. But in addition to that is the portion of foregone revenue that doesn't actually flow through our capital budget. So it's not a direct expenditure, but it's foregone revenue that helps provide supports to help us achieve our goals. That includes land value as well as incentives and other foregone revenues.
But if it's foregone revenue, then how can you've showed 30.5 billion coming in, and then you've put a marker for $4.7 billion not being used, foregone on the other side. So
Yeah, sorry.
how did these two columns balance?
Sorry, I'll add
I'm thick, maybe.
Yeah, the total capital investment that's noted of 30.5 billion is reflected by the funding sources that you see on the right that are kind of that mustard color. What we're saying is, in addition to the capital plan that we're presenting, there's additional investments that are being made by the city above and beyond what's included in our capital plan in the form of financial incentives that are provided to be able to support our housing goals. They don't flow through our capital budget.
So it is really money going out. Perhaps my issue is terminology. I don't think that's really what you want to call it. Otherwise, because if it's foregone revenue, it's money that is not collected, which means if you call it that, the sheet doesn't balance. Maybe we'll talk about it offline. I think you kind of have to call it something else. On page 22, if I go back into operating, on page 22 in childcare, the investment in childcare that I see here is the 32.2. Is that all the money that's coming from the other orders of government?
For you, Mr. Chair, Councillor, yes, it is. And we just noted that when we described that amount, that it is a one-time amount that's flowing through.
So if it's a one-time amount, I'm confused, but we're spending it on operating expenses?
Correct. It's operating funding that's flowing through from the federal government.
So if it's one time, if we inject it into the operating budget, we eventually have to replace it with property tax funds. Am I right about that?
Through you, Mr. Chair, actually, we're tracking it as a one-time revenue and a one-time expense. So we're not including it in our base on a go-forward basis.
I'm sorry to press on this, but I thought I heard you say that you were going to use it to make investments in staff.
Through you, Mr. Chair, actually, Councillor, I'm just going to go back to the comments that I made with regards to how it is being used. I described the purpose of where the funds are supposed to be directed to.
Right. And can you give me that description again? Because it included staffing, did it not?
I'm just pulling it up, Councillor.
Sure.
It is funding that is actually going to be flowed directly to the childcare sector. And it's
Right.
for the childcare sector to use to support the retention and recruitment of a workforce.
Okay, so if we're recruiting staff with it and it's one-time funds, we got a problem down the
So,
road, have we
Councillor,
not?
So just to clarify, we're flowing it through to the childcare sector,
Right.
not to our own childcare program.
Oh, so it'll be their pressure. We're not using it in the city-run, 100% city-run centers.
And that's just why I was highlighting that it is one time.
Okay, so there will be a pressure, but it will be for them later on down the road. I just have one other question, Mr. Chair. I don't know if you want me to ask in the 10 seconds.
Yeah,
It
go
is
for it.
just page 25, where we're looking at the rates. That includes the shift. We see the shift to the lower commercial rates and the discount for small businesses and such. How many more years do we have to make that shift so that we get to that ideal 2-to-1 ratio?
Actually, through you, Mr. Chair, Councillor, there is a slide in the appendix that shows, and we're almost there. We're just shy this year.
Ah, okay. I'll have a look at it and maybe ask more questions about that when we get to review days. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, it's Shanley here from Children's Services. Councillor Carroll, can I just provide some clarification around, because I see you have questions around the workforce.
Love it.
Okay, so this is a federally funded one-time program. The intent is that the money will go to the sector for professional learning, to develop a workforce strategy for recruitment and retention of staff, and to sort of embed some anti-racist and anti-colonial lens into ECE practice, and to try and attract and recruit a diverse workforce. So it's not for compensation, which means there will not be a pressure. It's an enveloped specific program to support the workforce.
So it's really a program with a beginning and a middle and an end.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Shanley. Councillor Layton, you're next.
Thank you very much, Mr. Budget Chief. And I'm just going to say off the top, like the last 4 years, despite some disagreements along the way, I think I very much valued my position here and in particular your leadership on the committee. Sir, you've made it an easy process throughout to both collaborate as well as disagree on the rare occasion. First, on the total shortfall that we're seeing in the budget and part of the balancing strategy, the global federal ask just for the COVID related pressures, do you have that broken down? Like what is it we're asking from which level of government and for what?
You, Mr. Chair. Councillor, actually, it isn't broken down into specific what is the federal government funding and what is the province funding. In 2020, when COVID first surfaced, there was a joint funding program that the federal government announced, and then the province worked with the funds that they received from the federal government and matched. In 2021, we had a different experience. We received more of our funding from the province than we did from the federal government. So it's not as if we're asking for a fixed amount from the province or the federal government. It's actually conversations and ongoing discussions with both levels of government about what the solution could be.
Is there an ideal arrangement that we would like to enter into? Was option 1 better than option 2? Is there an option 3 that we've been asking for? Just trying to get an idea of what we as political entities should be advocating for.
1.4 billion.
Just 1.4. We really don't care how it gets here.
Correct.
In addition to the 1.4, there are other pressures around affordable housing, supportive housing. Do we know what that looks like outside of the 1.4? Like, for example, the supportive housing funding that came last year was one-time funding. What is the pressure in 2022? And what actually do we need from the provincial government in order to achieve our target, which was, I think like 800 new units a year? So what, do we know what that number is, or do we have an itemized list of what our other asks are, just to make the advancements that and commitments that we've made previously? In the case of supportive housing, we just need to fill that gap because there's a gap in the amount of money because it was 1 year worth of funding.
Through you, Mr. Chair, Councillor, if you refer to slide 19 in the presentation, we do highlight the 27 million that we are asking from the province of Ontario to continue to fund the supportive housing amounts.
And that's a continuation of funding. Is there any new, does any of that new money?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I would like to ask Abby to respond to that.
Good morning, Councillor. Good morning, Budget Committee. So the 27.6 million is the money that we need for 2022 to provide the operating dollars for the capital investment that we've been able to make in supportive housing. On an ongoing basis, that extra 2,000 units would need $48 million of operating per year.
Okay, so I'm a little bit confused here. So you're gonna have to help me out. So 27 million is new money.
It's the amount we need in 2022 to pay for the staffing and the operations of the new units that we have coming online in 2022.
So if I remember correctly, 2021's addition from the province wasn't long-term funding, it was 1 year funding. So
That's
how much is we're expecting, our budget just expects that to come back, correct?
So that 27.6 includes what we need for those units that we opened in 2021, as well as the new units in 2022. So it's the full amount needed for all of the supportive housing units in 2022. And then assuming we're able to get to that 2,000 units, which is our current 24-month plan, that is what we then need 48 million a year on an ongoing basis to keep those operations effective.
Okay, like I'm again a little confused. So does the 48 include the 27, or is it 48 above the 27?
So it would be 27.6, I think it is, for 2022, and then for 2023 it would be $48 million, and 2024 it would be 48 million, and 2025 48 million.
Okay, thank you. So it's a cumulative total that we need to, that includes 2021's operating dollars, 2022's operating dollars,
Exactly.
and 2023 and beyond's operating dollars.
Exactly.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Councillor. Any other questions from committee members? Councillor Nunziata, then McKelvey.
Yeah, I just have one question. As far as the dialogue that we're having with the province and the federal government, do you have any idea when we'll know on their commitment?
So through the chair, I can't give you a hard and fast date, but we would hope certainly in January, and certainly before council sits to decide on this budget. So those conversations are ongoing with the mayor's office, and but you know, that's the timing. I can't give you a precise date though.
Okay, so hopefully it will be before we go through the budget, before we approve the, yeah.
That would be ideal.
Okay, so we have to put a lot of pressure. Okay, thanks. That was my only question.
Thanks, Councillor. Next to Councillor McKelvey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your leadership on the budget process, and thank you to city staff too. My first question is, and you may have said that, so apologies, there's a lot of information in there. The 2021 budget, it's still said to balance out that we have 75 million pending. So what is that pending, and when might we hear about that?
Do you want me to take that? Through you, Mr. Chair, Councillor, that 75 million is the outstanding amount on our transit-related COVID pressure. And so that is an amount that was signaled in the fall economic statement that transit operators, there would be funding for transit operators, but we do not have a commitment letter. So we remain optimistic based on the fall economic statement, but we haven't yet received any funding or commitments.
Okay. And then the 2022 budget had a line for Omicron specific. So what is that funding, or where does that come from? That was that 195 million.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So, Councillor, as I tried to hint at, the budget process is obviously many months long. We didn't have any signals of a new wave coming in. And so by the end of November, we had landed our draft budget. That was prior to Omicron. And so what we had to do in the month of December is quickly look at what has our experience been in a large wave in the past. And we had to quickly build some assumptions into the budget. So we've singled it out. It's primarily being driven by transit ridership and our experience on when there are provincial shutdowns, et cetera, on what the impacts are on ridership. So that's the main driver. We have looked at other costs associated with, enhanced COVID expenses around PPE, rapid tests, et cetera.
Okay. Stephen Conforti mentioned the briefing notes, and I think you made it sound like they were coming out today, but I don't see them. So when are briefing notes? Will those be available with next week's public with next week's meetings?
There's a series of briefing notes that are developed to support materials as part of the budget launch. These are briefing notes that come out in advance of a request. So traditionally, we would have our safety repair briefing note. There'll be the climate briefing note. So those materials have been submitted to clerks. I'll have to confirm with clerks when they'll be available publicly. My understanding is it should be following this meeting.
Following this meeting. Okay, so in advance of the next meeting, so we can start to have a look through those. Okay. And then the last question I have is, you mentioned the provincial property assessment has been delayed. Do we know when that might be?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Unfortunately, Councillor, we don't. It has been delayed twice, but that is up to the province, and they haven't disclosed to us what the new date will be.
So, we'll all get a surprise, because I'm sure most people's homes will be reassessed at a higher value, given that I think last year they said property. I think people's homes are making more money than they are. So how do we mitigate that risk, or how do we look at that with the percentages that we're putting forward for our property increase, so people aren't getting a big surprise when the province goes out and does the reassessment?
So I will try and explain it in a simple way, but I hope Casey Brendan is on the line, who probably will do a better job than I will. But there is a legislative requirement that in a year of reassessment, that in actual fact, the tax roll does not increase. The tax revenue that we generate from property tax doesn't. And what I mean by that is there are areas where they look at the proportionate increases. So if your house increases at 10% and everybody in your neighborhood is 10%, you won't actually experience an increase. But there will be some properties that appreciate at a different rate. So depending on the neighborhood, et cetera, some properties may, in a proportionate way, increase or decrease, which is when they will feel a change in their tax. But the city itself doesn't actually generate more revenue.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Lai has questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My apologies, I cannot turn on my video due to some issues. I just thank you, staff, for the very, very detailed presentation. Some of my questions has been answered by the presentation, but I just have one question, a few questions here that I may missed. In the report, in the presentation, the city is supporting this year's budget is supporting economic recovery in the city after COVID. Can you tell me how much money in this budget that we are actually allocating to this support?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Councillor, we haven't tracked it specifically that way because it's actually woven throughout different programs. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So as I mentioned, in 2022, for the first time ever, we have a small business subclass. So there are supports through a property tax rate reduction to small businesses. About 25,000 small businesses will benefit from that. That is part of our economic recovery. In addition to that, we look for partnerships with other levels of government to ensure that we are supporting programs. Another example is Cafe TO being made permanent. So there are different elements of economic recovery that are woven throughout the budget. I'm happy to take that offline and see if we can quantify that, but we don't track it specifically as money specific to economic recovery. I feel that we would miss picking up essential programs because a lot of the decisions that we have made in this year's budget are really focused on recovery.
I saw the $3.1 billion in the capital investment support local economy. What is it all about?
I will ask Steve to also contribute to this, but what we were saying is that from a job perspective, where for every $1 million that we spend in capital, we create 9 jobs. And so when you look at our $3.1 billion investment in our capital plan, we are creating over 20, I think it works out to over 25,000 jobs just in our $3.1 billion investment. So from our perspective, by investing in capital, we are creating jobs for the local economy.
Thank you. That really clarifies my understanding about that. And the other question is on the same token, like Councilor McKelvey was saying, you know, our home is making more money than some of the people out there. Do we have any special measures to help people that are affected by COVID if they cannot afford to pay their property tax due to the increase? Are there any measures that the city is offering for that?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Councillor. There are programs that we have offered in the past and we will continue to offer. So this is for low-income seniors. We have in the past offered also programs to people who have been financially impacted by COVID on an application basis. So these are programs that will continue to be offered in 2022.
Okay, my next question will be, will the rising interest rate this year by Bank of Canada have any impact on the city's budget?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So our 10-year capital plan is built on a series of assumptions, and our modeling has taken into account. We've worked very closely with the capital markets people to ensure that our projections over the next 10 years are following the economists and what they are projecting. So it does include increased interest rates.
Okay, for the new capital spending, like housing, are we looking into the future and planning for ongoing operation costs?
Again, I'll answer, and maybe Steve would like to augment it. So when we invest in capital, we create outlooks. So in the capital submission of a project, we look to the end of the capital investment and what operational requirements are made, and those are incorporated into our submissions as well as our outlooks. And in addition to that, and the example that Councillor Perks asked about is that there are partnerships that we're also seeking. So where we invest as a city in capital, we look to other orders of government to help support and augment the operational requirements.
Okay, thank you, Heather. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Councillor. I do have a few questions myself, and then I think there was an interest in doing a second round if possible. It's either to Heather, Steve, or Chris. This is a balanced budget. Legislatively, legally, we have to do that. But of course, it's balanced on the support, 1.4 billion from the other levels of government. They've been very supportive over the last couple of years, which is great. But can you talk a bit, and I think Steve mentioned that about it's balanced on the back or the backstop of capital. And can you talk a bit about that? Again, in the event, that money doesn't come in, I'm hoping it doesn't, but how it could impact the capital program. Have you done, and you probably haven't at this point, but at some point you'll have to look at, programs we won't be able to achieve. Can you just talk a bit about that in the event that we don't get the supports from that? I'm not anticipating it, of course, but the work that you have done in the backstop and in managing the capital balancing.
Chris, do you want me to take that? Okay.
Yeah, I think so, for sure.
Okay, so thank you, Councillor. So we are legislatively required to have a balanced budget, And although there is an ask from other orders of government, we have ensured that we have a backstop. And the backstop is the use of monies that we have put in a reserve specifically for COVID pressures. The concern for us is that we know that the COVID pressures are not going to go away by a flick of a switch at the end of 2022. And so our goal is to keep that COVID backstop available to us for future years. However, that backstop that we've created has been created by funds that would have otherwise been directed to the capital plan. So I'll give you a couple of examples. In 2021, we received a one-time doubling of the federal gas tax. That amount would have normally been invested in the capital plan. What we've done is we've held back, we've put it in a COVID reserve. In addition, council approved in 2021 the excess of our MLTT from the amounts that we had budgeted. We took that surplus and we put it in a COVID backstop, again, to help us get through or weather the storm of COVID uncertainties, not just in 1 year, but the out years, because we do know that it's going to take a number of years, even for our transit system to rebound. So all the monies that we've put in the backstop would have otherwise been directed to our capital plan. Now, to your point about knowing if the money doesn't come in, what capital programs would be impacted, we are looking at that right now. We're creating that contingency plan. I also mentioned in the presentation that a portion of the operating monies that are being generated from MLTT are being directed as our contribution from current to our capital plan. Those amounts will also be withheld. So we're going through the capital plan as we speak to identify what projects have not yet entered into commitments, which ones can be paused, deferred, and obviously knowing that if we do that, we're canceling some projects and we're missing the building season as well. So these are the risks that we're trying to relay to other levels of government.
So, and then I think the question was asked and answered too, but just to reiterate that on the timelines. So we begin the budget process. We don't have the commitments yet. We're keeping our fingers crossed that they come as soon as possible. But, you know, can we finish the budget process in February without the kind of commitments that we need before we have to start making decisions on, you know, what we do? So can you just describe the sort of timeline aspect of these commitments and when you would hope to come in as quickly as possible?
So in a typical year, as soon as the budget is approved, the capital projects, division heads that have capital projects start entering into procurement activity and awarding contracts for the upcoming capital season. In the event that February 17th comes and goes and we do not have agreements or commitments from other levels of government, we will have to pause all the capital projects that would have entered into procurement activities at the time of budget approval.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions. Why don't we do a quick second round? Just I know it's there's a lot of information there, so why don't we just do a quick second round to see if we have any other questions? Councillor Perks, I think you'd already indicated you want to have a few questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. At the last few council meetings where we have received operating variances, I've asked a number of questions about the capacity for city staff to hire and retain staff, and was told that, you know, we were, and this is nothing, this is prior to the Omicron absences. That's not what I'm asking about. I was told that we could expect some major gaps in the short term, but that we were bringing on additional HR staff so that we could get to the staff complement that we have approved. Does this budget still allow for that?
Through the chair, it does.
Thank you very much. Just following on what Councillor Layton was asking, just procedurally, he asked about briefing notes, but when they're going to be available. There's also the set of analyst notes and the appendices that show the fees, the user fees, and the details on capital spending. Are those going to be posted and available to members of council and the public today?
Through the chair, yes, those have all been completed and submitted to clerks.
So the clerk is going to post them today?
Yes.
Yes, okay, thank you. just a couple of program-specific things that I want to understand. I just glanced at the new and enhanced, and I didn't see any new and enhanced for Vision Zero. Is there any?
Maybe put the time on hold.
Yeah.
We get staff.
That's a long pause, so yes, if Barbara's on the call, if she could comment.
I don't think she is, Chris.
My apologies. This is the host to the chair. It appears that Barbara Gray is on the line and is unmuted, but we can't hear her. Barbara, if you can see if maybe the device you're using is muted, the headset also has a mute and unmute button. Okay. No, I see that you are unmuted, but we can't hear you. It looks like your mic is also raised. Can you bring it closer to your mouth?
Oh, maybe that's it. Is that it?
Thank you.
Sorry.
Yes, we can see and hear you.
Sorry
Thank
with
you.
these mundane problems in a very important topic. I apologize. With regard to Vision Zero, certainly we have our ongoing budget amounts, no specific operating budget increases for Vision Zero this year or capital.
Thank you. To the CFO, at I think it was last council meeting or perhaps the one previous, maybe even at Planning and Housing Committee, we had asked that consideration be given to an annual investment in the multi-unit residential acquisition program. Has an annual amount in the capital program been allocated for that?
Through you, Mr. Chair, Councillor, there is funding for that program in 2022 that is coming from another source, but that is in actual fact, just to let you know, because we don't end up owning those units that are acquired through the MURA, it will be operating funding, not capital funding.
Okay,
Just,
but is there
that's just FYI. But yes,
Oh.
there is 10 million set aside for 2022.
There's okay. In many instances, we acquire land and then lease it long term. So we're not allocating for that.
I'm going to ask Abby to respond to how the MURA program will specifically work.
Okay, thank you.
Through the chair, as Heather mentioned, the majority of funds will be flowing direct to nonprofits to enable their acquisition of buildings, and so it's flowing through the operating dollars. We do have money separately for strategic acquisitions on the capital side, should the city want to step in and make purchases. For 2022, the money that we have available for MURA is $10 million plus the $10 million that we're carrying forward from 2021. So we will have a fund available for 20 million to issue to the nonprofit sector through that proposal process that we outlined and piloted in your ward.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you. Any other outside councillors that have questions? Okay, I don't see any. Let me just flip. No. Okay. So any other committee members have questions? Councillor Nunziata and then Leighton.
Yeah, I just have one question on Chair, the question that you asked the CFO. When you mentioned it, if we don't receive the funding from the federal and provincial government, that there would be some capital projects that would be deferred. So if that happens, would you bring forward a list to the council if that's the case?
For you, Mr. Chair, I think staff are looking at right now, what are the opportunities? If it comes down to having to prioritize amongst those programs, then that is definitely an option.
Okay. Well, the good news is that there's a provincial election this year, so that'd be good news for us.
Thank you. I think Councillor Layton, did you have your hand up, I think?
Yes, thank you very much. And it is good news there's an election year this year. Can I ask, election aside, because it's not until June, we're in a pretty immediate crisis situation beyond COVID with our shelter system. There are a series of enhancements to the shelter support and housing, shelter support and housing administration budget that would relate to things like homeless prevention, workforce stabilization, and respite service standards. Can we get an idea of if the necessary resources are in place right now, like as of 11/27, Thursday, January 13th, 2022, are the necessary resources available for our divisional staff and the emergency leadership table to undertake the necessary steps to get people indoors? Like, we got 2 days, it's going to be minus 20 tomorrow or overnight tomorrow, and I am so incredibly worried that people are afraid to go into our shelters because of overcrowding. We don't have the necessary space in shelter hotels because we don't have any more. What can we do right now to make sure you have the resources? Do you have them? And if so, can we just advance the money to that program right now?
So Gord and or Paul Johnson, if you could respond to that question, please. Thanks.
Yes, thanks. And through the chair, Councillors, Gord Tanner here. So we do have the resources we need right now to enhance some of the supports and spaces available in the shelter system. We're working very hard to open additional space just before the weekend. As you note, it's going to get much colder, so we're looking at a couple of options to increase beds, and that will be relayed both to yourself through council and to the public within the next 24 hours or so. We are using redeployed staff to assist us with delivery of services in the shelter system and for these enhanced supports. And I think, part of the note there related to Omicron costs, we have received support through the senior leadership team at the city to do things such as rolling out a pandemic pay bump to our nonprofit shelters to support the staffing that are there, enhanced PPE N95 masks for staff. Today, N95 masks approved to roll out to clients. So to answer your question, just in summary, do we have the resources today? We do, and we'll continue to bring any additional asks that we have through the senior leadership team for their consideration and review.
Okay, thank you very much. That's reassuring to hear, Paul. So thank you. And I just want to make sure that we understand if there's any barriers to us rolling out a rapid, more robust winter response. Like, please feel free to reach out. You don't have to tell me on the call now. There's several of us that would love to give that support. On the climate lens for capital projects, is Steve on the? Of course he is. I see him right there. Steve, 15.5 billion was the number that we calculated for climate related work. You're going to have a breakdown of project by project.
We do have a breakdown within a briefing note that's provided that will show by division, and then within the budget notes themselves, there's an identifier within the project list, just a little kind of green leaf or check mark that shows which projects have climate.
Okay, but it'll identify specific projects in those. In the divisional list will identify what they are, and we're still on just capital projects, correct?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to say some of the feedback, and I'm going to use my last 40 seconds to say this, some of the feedback that we gave throughout the early process, I was very pleased to see it, and I know it's a little bit nerdy, but on the appendix itself, the two final columns are extremely helpful in painting a picture of what we budgeted in the previous year and the last couple of years, and as it's changed over time. So I just wanted to thank whoever laid that out that way. I think there was one outstanding question about the total number of FTEs and based on the salary projections for the year and how many people will be in chairs that I hope to see as part of the analyst notes. But I'd like to thank whoever set these sheets up, because they certainly were listening to us in our advanced briefing. So my appreciation. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor. Any other questions? Councillor Carroll.
Just one last one for my review. So just to be clear, in the appendix in the presentation, the new and enhanced here, it's page 7 through 9. That's the 54 million worth of new and enhanced that is embedded in the draft budget?
Through you, Mr. Chair, the 54 million is the net impact on the city's budget, but you'll see
Right.
134 million in gross expenditures.
Right, but it's included. These are not if we want them. These are the ones we have chosen to include.
That's correct.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Councillor. And seeing no questions, again, I think this concludes our business for today. We'll be back again next Tuesday where we get into all the reviews. And again, just a reminder, it may be a little premature now, but if you have any briefing notes based on this, try to get them in as quickly as possible, because I can't underestimate how challenging some of the staff will be in trying to get these briefing notes too. They want to do it, but just if we can chat over the next number of days as we formulate and pull all this together. On that, again, thanks staff, thanks everybody for coming out, and we'll see everyone next week. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mr. Chair.